Hey, welcome to the show. Glad you could join us today on the Cam and Otis show. Today, we're going to talk a bit about our man Shackleton, uh, and his expedition to attempt to traverse, be the first man, human to team, whatever, to traverse across the Antarctic, and what happened, what occurred to him and his expedition team, and the leadership lessons that came from that. And it's an unbelievable story if you're not familiar with it, and what happens during this 2+ year event, if you will, and you think about the time and the technology that these men survived through, and the weather and the environment they survived in. It's quite an amazing story, and generally speaking, those of us looking back on it and analyzing it contribute to the the survival of his team to Ernest Shackleton's leadership ability. And I know, Camden, you've got a bit of the background of the story to kind of, for folks who haven't read it. And there's two books. There's one called The Endurance, and one that's just called South, that was written by Sir Ernest Shackleton himself. Highly recommend you pick those up and read them. So,
Yes,
Cam, give
sir.
us a little bit of that background on the story, please.
All right. So for those of y'all who don't know and couldn't guess by his name, Ernest Shackleton was a British explorer, believe it or not. And so he was a British explorer focused mainly in the Antarctic during what was known as the Age of Heroes, and we'll talk some about that later on in the podcast. But his first record-breaking moment was with as a member of the crew of the Nimrod. They got the closest at that time that anyone has ever been to the South Pole. They were less than 100 miles away from the South Pole, furthest anyone had made it at that time. Then after that, they went back a few years later. He threw together another expedition, and they were, I know, literally racing an Austrian team, if I remember right.
That's
That
right.
so it was the Brits versus the Austrians, and they were racing to the South Pole there at the same time, and it was this big, big, big political event. And they lost, unfortunately. If I remember right, the Austrians used dog sled teams, and Ernest Shackleton tried to use actual sleds with motors, and the fuel was too heavy, and they lost. Um, so then, after he lost the race to the South Pole, he set his eyes on the Transarctic expedition that you mentioned. So that is just going from sea to sea across Antarctica, basically longest point to longest point. That hadn't been done yet, and definitely hadn't been done with dog sled teams like they were going to do. So they left or started putting the team together in 1912, 1913, started laying out the plans and doing a lot of the fundraising. And we'll pause at lots of different moments throughout the story because there's just so many leadership moments and so much great insight you can get from Shackleton, and talking about him funding the expedition. So this was would have been after two consecutive failures. He was trying to finance this mission and he could not get any money for it. So what he did was, this is right when cameras and movies were starting to come around, right? So he sold all of the photography rights and all of the video production rights off for thousands and thousands of dollars to finance his mission before they even left. And so he wound up bringing a very highly skilled photographer. So, like, I know the book I have, I'm not sure if South has this, but The Endurance has all these amazing pictures that he was taking throughout the entire expedition, and it just adds to it. But he had the foresight to see that ahead of time and to make a smart financial choice off that, which, just one of the many things he did that was amazing.
Well, and think about film and photography in that day and age too.
Mm-hmm. He
We're
was
not talking
gambling.
about your smartphone. We're talking about a big hunk of steel,
Mm-hmm.
maybe aluminum, cast aluminum, and the weight of the film, and it just, yeah,
Oh
it's
yeah. Well,
it's
and,
stuff that
and
fits in your pocket.
to jump ahead a little bit, when they go through, there's a moment of the story where they're going through, and each man is only allowed so much weight, because they can only take so much weight as they're journeying across the ice, because they know the dogs can pull that weight with this amount of food and yada yada yada, and that they can continue their expedition at that rate. And the photographer had to throw all of his camera equipment into the ocean, and I don't know exactly, but he basically took his 50 best what's the name, negatives, is that the right word?
Cartridges of film usually, or
Right.
the negatives. Yeah.
Right. So he took his 50 best pictures basically, and those are the ones that are in the book, is the ones he took home, that he carried with him the rest of the trip. But I'll go back to the story. So basically they're sailing in, and they get down there a little bit late. They get down there a little bit late. They wind up getting stuck in an ice sheet. And this is significant because the ice around Antarctica churns around and can be very, very catastrophic. There's a quote from Shackleton's journal, which is, what the ice gets, it keeps. And, spoiler alert, that's what happens to the Endurance. They get stuck in the ice. They try to wait out the winter, hoping that it would thaw enough that they'd be able to get out of it. And about few months left in the winter, I think, the whole ship breaks down, and they wind up getting completely lifted out of the water by two sheets of ice combining together, and it rips up the bottom of the ship, this old wooden ship, and they tear it up, and they wind up breaking down the ship, getting everything they could, moving off of it, and then living on this sheet of ice for months, waiting for winter to end. Then they break down the ship, any wood they could salvage, make it into sleds to continue going south. Then at that point, I think it's when they realize that that's a terrible idea, and he goes towards survival instead of the accomplishment of the mission, which is, again, a great leadership point right there, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, but I just wanted to, the ice sheets, you touched on it. They're not stationary. They're in constant movement. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things, when you hear about icebreakers and things like that, and what happened to the ship, the Endurance, that's what happened, is these sheets of ice move, and they're constantly shifting. It's just like a glacier does, right? Everybody knows that glaciers have a flow. It's not a stationary hunk of ice and snow. And that's what the Arctic and Antarctic sheets of ice do, is they're in constant motion, moving. And that's what causes the destruction. It's not like going out to your neighborhood pond that freezes over, and there's a piece of wood that was floating in it that freezes and gets stuck. It's nothing like that. It's on a much larger scale.
Right. And they talk a lot about that, the power behind it during the time where they're on the ship before they evacuate it. And they talk about the noise of the ice wrecking the ship beneath them, and they can't do anything about it. And they go through, I think, 2 or 3 different false evacuations where they, grab everything and get off the ship, and then it doesn't break. So they get back on because it was the only shelter they have. So then from there, I touched on this earlier, they go and he makes each man go, and they only got, 2 pounds that they could carry with them. So these are guys throwing gold pocket watches and everything out into the ocean, or actually they left them on the ice in the hopes that they could come back. I do remember they said that.
Yeah.
But they basically, each of them took their most prized possession. So some of them, it was that gold pocket watch, and a gold pocket watch and a journal. That's pretty much what each one of them took. And which is why, another reason why the story is so interesting, is you have so many journal excerpts from all these different guys. I think that's a great pausing moment right there to talk about the leadership. One, to have the skill and knowledge to be able to know, like, hey, each guy gets 1.5 pounds of his own personal items that he can take with us on the sleds, and that's it. And then the leadership to have that happen, and you don't get the crap beaten out of you, to be frank. I mean,
yeah. So, let's think about that. How did he do that? It wasn't just in that moment that he created that. And what he was working off of is the trust. The men on the expedition, the men in the team had the utmost trust in their leadership, and knew that what he said was in the best interest of their survival and their success initially, and then their survival eventually. And they trusted him in those decisions 100%. And how he developed that trust it goes all the way back to the selection process of how he picked the team. right? It's no different than how you pick your team for your business as you grow your business and how you build your team in that same thing. He went through a process of requirements and skill sets and experience and interviews with each of these men that he selected into his team and then trained them and put them together. And they were, I mean, what was it, 28 men, something like that?
28. That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, 28. 28 men. So think about that, locked up together in a vessel, and what, 3 4 months to get from England down to Antarctica to even start.
Mm-hmm.
Think about those confined spaces, and they're not playing Candy Crush on their phones, right?
Oh yeah, I think I'd love to dive a little bit more into that. The selection and the grouping of the party members. Like you said, there's 28 guys that he was working with, and I'm gonna call this 50-50. I'm not sure exactly what the split was, but roughly half of those guys were engineers, worked with their hands, ship workers, those type of things, and the other half were full blown scientists. So they had half the jocks, half the nerds on the boat, and he was able to keep them from killing each other for this entire expedition. I think, and there's smaller personality tweaks in between, but even just looking at the blue collar white collar difference that you get at the very beginning of it and how he handles that, and that kind of sets the precedent moving forward that we're all equal on this. Y'all might sleep on the deck below us, but they're still equal, and they still go through all of that together, and they work as a team. You talk about this in your book. There's a little plug for enable your team success, but you talk about you can't be scared to get your hands dirty, right? And Shackleton made sure that even though he talks about in the book plenty that a lot of those scientists weren't very tough guys, but they were in it. They were bought in 100%, and they were in it till the end. And they worked their asses off just as much as the engineers and the shipwrights did.
So they believed in the mission, right? That when
Exactly.
we go back to talk about the business and selecting your team and building your team, and how you create that successful team, it's the fact that the members of the team believe in the mission. And you can relate this back to my time in special forces. We believed in the mission that we were assigned to perform, and that was how we created the success, and how we survived in the situations that we were in, and then even today in what the guys are doing in Iraq, Afghanistan, and around the world. And that's what Shackleton did with these guys. He hand selected them. He was, I mean, there's some definite talent and skill sets there that he developed over the years in his previous expeditions.
Mm-hmm.
He knew what he was looking for, so he was able to evaluate each of those team members to create that team of 28. And I'll just say, like I was talking about last week with the rugby team, the U.S. men's national team, when I was working with them, it's about creating the flow and operating as an organism
Mm-hmm.
and not as a bunch of individuals. Even in smaller groups of individuals, still not success. It's about operating as an entire organization together to create that flow, and that's what Shackleton did here with this selection process. It begins with the mission set that he created and the vision he had, and then selecting men that bought into that same vision, bought into him as a leader and the vision that he had, and included them in joining him.
Yes, sir. And that's you're 100% right. That's what led them to be able to accomplish all these tremendous feats. So I won't go through the exact details because they're amazing, and I don't remember all of them. This is the biggest page turner about guys stuck on an ice sheet that you will ever freaking read. I can tell you that much. It was a fast There we are.
All right,
Okay.
let's give it just a
You
few
got me now?
seconds here. Yep, I got you
Yep.
now. That was at 14 minutes and 14 seconds. So let's go to 15:30. Restart with that same line, please. I'll point at you. You're at 15:10 now. Do you remember where you
Okay.
were?
Which line was that? Had I said they sank yet?
No.
Okay.
So 10 seconds.
Should I just do the whole thing again then?
Yeah, just do the whole thing.
Okay, so going back to the story here. So the Endurance gets stuck in this ice sheet and they're slowly drifting away from Antarctica, getting further and further away from their goal as they're stuck because it was too chaotic there, and there was too much breaking ice. They could have very easily slipped in the ocean overnight while they were sleeping. So they move off the ice sheet and find a more stable area. About a month later, the Endurance sinks after being crushed by the ice. Then a few months after that, they take the sleds that they had built out of the Endurance, break them down, and build them into boats, and then sail the boats off into Elephant Island, which was about, I got the notes right here, about 100 miles off from the ice sheet. So they get there
in the Antarctic Ocean. We're
yes.
not talking. We're not in the Caribbean. We're not in the Gulf of Mexico. We're in the Antarctic Ocean. And if you've never seen video of the water down there, it is. I've never personally experienced it, but I've seen plenty of episodes and videos of various documentaries, and that water down there is unbelievable.
Chalky doesn't even begin to describe it.
Yes, and cold.
Yeah.
You know, that water is like constantly in below 35 degrees. It's probably closer to 30 degrees most of the time.
And so they sail 100 miles in that, and they get to this to the bay of Elephant Island. And so to kind of paint the picture a little bit, this is also April in the southern hemisphere at this point, so it's getting freaking cold too, even for Antarctica. And it is at this point you have guys getting frostbite. Guys are literally frozen because the water you're sailing on homemade boats that you threw together over the course of a few weeks out of sleds. You're not able to really do anything to combat the waves. And so they're all soaked to the bone and frozen. And they talk about literally being like, if you stopped rowing, you would freeze solid because your clothes would all freeze that fast. So I don't remember exactly how long it took them. I want to say it took them about a week or two to get to that island, somewhere along those lines. And they set up there and they build camp. And Shackleton starts looking at it and basically realizes that there's no hope for them ever to get rescued on this little island in the middle of the Antarctic Ocean, or Antarctic Sea. Ooh, the Scotia Sea. See, that's why I have notes out in front of me. And the Scotia Sea. And this island it wasn't a whaling island or a fishing island. It was just an island. There was nothing built on it. So they take their boats and use all but one of them to build a shack, put all the guys in there. They hunt penguins and eat penguins and any fish they can catch. And after a little bit of time, Shackleton realizes that this isn't going to work, that they can't do this forever, and that the men are going to go crazy. And so he picks 3 men to go with him, and they set course for another island, which is South Georgia Island. And South Georgia Island was a whaling island that operates year-round. So they knew that they would be able to find people there. One of the fundamental problems is they're on the west side of South Georgia Island, and the bay, the port where they could get into, is on the east side. So they wind up sailing across. He picks 3 men to go with him. They go through this 460-mile journey, something insane like that. I doesn't have it in the notes right here, but it's over 400-mile journey with the 4 of them in a freaking rowboat across the Antarctic Ocean in the dead of winter. And they get there and they crash on the far side of the island, and then have to hike through the snowy mountains. They talk about going through 10-foot snowdrifts to get across the other side. I want to stop there for a second before we talk about the aftermath of once they get to that whaling village. And I wanted for you to kind of touch on the selection. And I should have gotten the guy's name out in front of me, but we probably shouldn't talk too bad about him. He's been dead for a long time. But there's an engineer in the group. And this engineer is the one thorn in Shackleton's side the entire time, from the moment they leave Argentina to the point where they get back to Britain. He is a thorn in his side, right? And so can you kind of dive in on that, so get into the selection part there?
Well, that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, if you have a team full of yes men, then who's checking you? So yeah, I mean, it may be. It may be one of those things where you just have to deal with it. It may be frustrating, but you know what? If somebody is checking you,
Mhm.
that's probably a good thing, because to have a bunch of people that just stand around and go, "Oh yeah, great idea, great idea, great idea." Well, who's checking to make sure it's right? And yeah, it can be frustrating because if you've led organizations long enough, you will run across people that are against everything you say,
Mhm.
and that's what this guy was. But he also fell in line.
Right.
So
And
he would say, no, no, no. And Mr. Nate, this won't work. This is stupid. But you know what? When Shackleton said, no, that's it. All right, we're going this way, he would shut up and shovel.
yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Or row.
There was a moment where they were when they're trekking across the ice while they're still stuck on that ice sheet, and they're in they got their sled line going through across the ice, and he's back then. He's just jabbering. Why the hell are we doing this? Shackleton doesn't know anything. We're all gonna die. And he's just going. And Shackleton, who you'll learn throughout this book, I think this is the only time he ever probably yelled at anyone. And he sets down his sled and marches all the way back down there and basically shut the hell up, quit your bitching, get back in line. Guess what he did? He shut up, quit his bitching, got back in line because he didn't want to die, and he believed Shackleton on that. And that's, you can talk about that a little bit. The being able to control yourself. If you're a yeller all the time, your yelling doesn't do that much. But if you're a really quiet coach, you're a really quiet leader, and then you yell, oh my gosh, people will listen to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's all about the style. I mean, if you're a yeller and screamer all the time, then what do you do in a crisis situation?
Mm-hmm. That's a
Right?
great way of putting it.
It becomes a learned behavior for your team. So if you yell and scream, throw a fit, yell names, call people stupid, idiots, whatever, all the time, and then when something bad happens, whether we're talking sports team, business, whatever, and something bad happens, how are you going to express that? Are you going to express that the opposite direction by talking in a nice, calm, monotone voice? And what do you think is going to happen then? And also in the same respect, I would also say, if you're a yeller and a screamer sort of leader, then your team becomes callous to that, and they also you are also becoming a leader of fear.
Right.
You lead by fear as opposed to leading through trust and knowledge and caring for your team. And that's what Shackleton did. He cared for these men. This wasn't a self-preservation thing, because he could have easily taken a couple of guys and said, all right, you guys stay here, we'll be back. And he easily survived and easily made it out with just a handful of the strongest men and not cared about the rest. But he cared deeply about each and every one of those guys.
Right.
They cared deeply about him, and that's how they were all able to survive.
And so going back to kind of the group selection and talking about that final trip, or the penultimate trip, I guess, compared to going back for them, he took the engineer with him because he knew that he was going to be a thorn in his first mate's side, and that there was likely a chance that there would be mutiny because, like we talked about, everyone's bought in on Shackleton. That's not a question. But if Shackleton's not there, all of a sudden this engineer gets a little bit more clout and a little bit more people start listening to him. And that's the problem he foresaw. And so he took him on that final journey with him, even though he was probably the last person on the freaking planet, besides one of his many ex-wives. There's a little history bit. But that he wanted in that boat with him. But he took him with him anyway, because he knew it was the smartest thing for the team. You know, it's kind of the keep your friends close and your enemies closer type thing.
Well, it's that, but it's that to a different degree. I would say it's truly knowing everybody on your team and what makes them tick. What's their skills? What's their weaknesses? How can you get the most out of those people? And knowing those things, it is what successful leaders know and can apply to how they move forward. And that's what Shackleton was able to do in some of the most terrible situations that you could ever come up with. He managed that situation. And, we don't have true insight into, did he sit back and how did he analyze it? How much discussion did he have amongst his leadership team? Or was it, okay, this is what we're going to do? I mean, I believe he, just knowing what kind of leader he was, he probably talked to people all the time, involved his leadership team in 99.9% of all the decisions, because if you have that leadership team involved in the decisions, then they get buy-in, right? Yep. By participation, as opposed to, again, going back to that leadership style of just telling people what to do. That is, that only works for just a short period of time. You can get away with it in crisis situations, but to truly have a team that's successful and truly have a team that is in the flow, you've got to have that trust. You've got to have that inclusion with your team and get their buy-in in everything you do.
Definitely. Well, one thing I think I want to shift it over this way, because I want to make sure we talk about this, because I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of the story, and make sure we don't run over the time a little bit too much on this, is the aftermath of the whole situation. So I mentioned he gets to South Georgia Island, and he then has to go through this long process of trying to get whalers to go and rescue his men. So he gets a whaling ship after months of trying to, bribe people. I think he winds up getting a loan basically wired from England and able to say, look, like, I will pay you for this ship, but we need to go rescue my men now. And they get out there. And at this point, it's already hitting winter again. And the island is frozen in an ice pack. And they're able to get, I think the first time they go, they're able to get about 30 miles in. And then he goes back and they get an Argentinian icebreaker. And they go in and they get, I think, about 20 miles offshore, to the point where they can see this island, and he can, not see them in probably, but they can see that there's an island there, and they can't get into it. And this takes pretty much a full year for him to be able to get back to that island and be able to rescue his men. And during this time, you can really see the passion he had for his men and the conviction he had in the mission, because he completely goes to shambles. And it's terribly sad, because it's such a happy ending to such a terrifying story. But when you read about what happens to him afterwards, he goes from a guy who barely ever had a whiskey to a full-blown alcoholic in that 1 year span, because he is drinking himself to death watching, because he's just sure that his men are dying on there. And it's terrible, but it shows the passion he had for all those men that he was working with.
Yeah, that's a powerful point to make too, and how much he cared, deeply cared for those men, his team. And I think there's a lesson learned in that also, in the fact of the acceptance of, you've done all you can do, and you have to draw that point, right? How much are you willing to accept and take the burden of that guilt? And it wasn't in the sense of a a true survivor's guilt,
Mhm.
but it was a guilt that he had no idea, were they all dead? Had he made a mistake? So he was what happened was he started to doubt. He
Yep.
started to doubt his decisions. And as a leader, when you start to doubt your decisions, your confidence goes down and your guilt goes up. And
Mhm.
you
And
start
I could infer a lot for, kind of like you're touching on the way, he started doubting himself and being that kind of self-critical, I could have done more. You can pick that up in the tone a lot of his writings and things of like he could if he had a if he oh, I'm trying to oh, I should have reread this right beforehand because I know there's a piece they make a few decisions that
Mhm.
you could say led them to getting stuck in the ice pack in the first place. They were a week leaving or some week late leaving, and
Yeah.
that type of little, and that's what happens is that eats away at him, and he doesn't accept that that's in the past and he can no longer control it. He lets it eat away at him over and over.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a great leadership trait to a point.
Hmm.
But when you waller in it, one of the ways I like to describe it is when you waller in that point, as opposed to accepting that it happened that way, and how can I improve off of that? And
Hmm.
how can I do better? When you go back and you continue to waller in the past of a decision that you made, that guilt comes up, and you what if yourself to death, and you stop looking and envisioning the future,
Hmm.
and you worry more about what has happened that you can no longer control or change. And that's a bad place for a leader to be. And that's why he got to that point
Hmm.
where he just lost it. He drowned himself in alcohol and eventually died of alcoholism because of the guilt that he felt, the failure that he felt for not accomplishing what he wanted to
Hmm.
accomplish, and the guilt that he felt for those early decisions that he felt destroyed the opportunity to be successful.
Hmm. Um, yeah, and I'd like to go a little bit further into the aftermath of once they actually get back to Britain. And for those of y'all who don't have your history books out, that year 1914 when they left, that's a little bit significant, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So what is it? They're not even down in Argentina yet at this point when World War One starts, and they wind up uh, radioing back to Britain and saying, "Do you need us to turn around? We're ready to fight if we need to." And they say, "No, our country needs you to go accomplish this feat."
Mm-hmm.
So the country was behind them, and as they're gone, that 3 years, Europe, of course, descends into the chaos of World War One. And they come back and talk about these guys and their sense of servitude that they had and their passion for the country and for uh whatever else you can call it. Most of these guys go back and enlist in the Navy, in the Royal Navy, and fight in World War One. Many of them died in World War One at that time. Shackleton, he was unable to. He was too sick after this, but they all get medals, of course. He winds up being knighted, but it kind of goes back to the leadership thing of the one person that didn't get a medal was the engineer because he passed the fact that he didn't trust him, and he held that against him. I mean, really for the rest of his life, and kind of shows, as we're talking about this is the best leadership story I can think of, one of the best I've read, of course. But as we go through and we dive into it more, you see those flaws, and you can really see the flaws there that are hidden behind all of the greatness of what he was able to do.
Yeah, yeah. So uh, that's a great point. I think the ideal situation, and the Monday morning quarterback situation of that is, you should have thanked that guy. That
Mhm.
guy probably should have gotten one of the more prestigious medals for being the naysayer and challenging Shackleton to look at the situation from a different point of view.
Mhm.
And by having that, the negative Nancy on the team, then Shackleton always had to have his ducks in a row, and he always had to have an understanding of, okay, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but here's the outcome of the way I see this happening, and here's the second and third order effects of this happening.
Mhm.
and here's the risk, and there's the risk I'm willing to accept about going in this course of action, as opposed to doing what you're saying, which is stay here and die, right?
Right. Yeah, it's amazing. So I think we can wrap it up on that. Highly recommend this book. Definitely, I haven't read South yet either, but The Endurance is amazing, and I'm sure South is great too. And I think there's some movies out there. I'm not sure if they're any good though.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure there's a documentary. I know there's a documentary or two out there, and it's an amazing story.
At the very least, go check out some of these pictures. I'm flipping through it right now. There's ones of them digging through the ice at multiple points. There's ones of them in the ship. There's ones of the ship after it's lifted up in the air. There's pictures of the camps they set up. It's really just amazing. It's kind of that great turn of the century moment where we're able to get all of these, all these pictures of things that you wouldn't think you'd be able to. One thing we forgot to touch on, and I mentioned this at the beginning, otherwise we could skip over it, was the Age of Heroes. I kind of want to, would you think you could dive in on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, the Age of Heroes was, the last great expeditions. It was the first evers sort of things. And, what were the things that were left to explore and find, the Northwest Passage, through the Arctic Ocean,
Right.
Crossing the Antarctic, all those sort of things, and this glory of wanting to be the first ever. And I think that's probably the simplest way of describing the Age of Heroes in that time, as our society shifted from survival mode, if you will, where you just did things to survive, to the expedition and exploration mode of finding the next great adventure.
Right. And this is also, the Age of Heroes ends with World War I, because the way they put it is after World War I, there were no heroes besides war heroes. And at that point, what they did was amazing, but what they cared about more was their service for their country after this expedition. And it's the kind of sad irony of when you go through and you're reading about this is, they get some recognition for the amazing things they did. There's books, but relative to what it is, if they'd done this 10 years ago, completely different story. But because they left right as World War I was starting, like they were told, they wanted them to accomplish this feat for British pride and to bring the country together. But oh my gosh, just tore the guys up in every single one of them. And they still, once they came back, the world had completely changed, I think. You talk about there's periods of times where you get that very, whether it's catastrophic or technological or whatever it is, that periods of rapid change, they were gone for one of those.
Yeah. Well, and when you analyze, not to dive into World War I, but you analyze the culture of the nations and how it looked like, and really it's an interesting shift from the Age of Heroes, because the Age of Heroes, everybody worshiped these heroes, and all these men who volunteered and went and fought in World War I, that's what they were looking for, was that kind of glory. When they went to, you look at the songs, you look at the videos, you read about World War I, and that was the culture of the time. It wasn't just an attitude of service for your nation. It was more of to be a hero for your nation. And so I think that's an interesting how the Age of Heroes ended with World War I is that's why. I mean, that's my point of view of how it ended. We went from worshiping these great expeditions and explorers, the first evers, to, like you said earlier, the war heroes, and
right.
How everybody, you could extrapolate that to today. What do young kids, young boys want to do? They want to be great sports players and athletes. Those are the, I hate to use the word hero because they're not truly, but those are the people we see on TV. They make millions of dollars, and that's
they got the glory.
Yeah, they've got the glory. So that's a similar thing that that was going on, at the turn of the 20th century,
Hmm.
is that hero worship. And when World War One happened, all these young men saw that as an opportunity to become heroes. Just like today, kids playing football in high school see themselves,
Yep.
90% of them at least see themselves as being a hero of a game, either in high school, college, or the NFL, winning the Super Bowl, being in the Hall
Oh
of
yeah.
Fame. That's what they see.
Like I love to use this example because I'm a big hockey fan, but I can't freaking skate. But I have scored more Game 7 overtime winning goals in my on our street in Colorado Springs than probably many people out there. Because you're always that's the point. You always want that glory.
Right.
That's when you're growing up. That's what you're looking at. And yeah. I mean, hell, we could do a whole episode on that, unpacking the different mindsets that drive people to do things like that. That could be interesting.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, what'd you learn today, Cam?
I did a lot of talking. Here, let's start with you. What you got? Oh, and there I go. I learned I need a new router.
Yes.
Can I use that? I need a new router before next week's episode.
Well, I learned. I wouldn't say I truly learned it, but I got a great history refresher on the Age of Heroes. I'd forgotten about that time period, honestly, and how that was some great point of how it transitioned out with World War One, and how World War One changed the entire world's
Mm-hmm.
culture of how we look at things. We look at life. We look at patriotism. We look at who our heroes are. World War One was that point
Mm-hmm.
when that changed.
And if I can retrace a little bit, I would say I learned what you were talking about with for the culture of the countries in World War One, and how for the British especially, how it was almost a not glory seeking kind of I think puts a little bit of a black mark over it, but the idea that wasn't the sense of, the combined with the sense of servitude was the desire to go make something of yourself, whether you wanted to be a war hero, when you wanted to be a hero for your town. That's what it was, and that was the opportunity that they saw, and I found that very interesting.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, man, this is another one that we can put up on the shelf and pull back down later, because the story of Shackleton and his men on the Endurance is such an amazing study of leadership style and teamwork, and teams working together to truly survive. And it's an amazing story. So, hey, thanks for joining us today, and I hope you have a great week. And I hope you've learned a few points and lessons in how to be a better leader here.